gave me something in common with Kazuo Ishiguro, which like otherwise we have nothing in common. So I'm not a novelist whose novels sell in multi-million kind of sales and win Nobel prizes and get turned into movies, but I do write the same thing over and over and over again. And so in that way, we're kind of the same, and he was kind of inspiring for me. And what's sort of helpful for me thinking about this question in terms of the body is it's not for me an immediate home intellectually or personally in many ways. And so for me, it was an interesting question when Annika and Juan approached me. Like, why me? Like, this doesn't make any sense. There's lots of other people to talk about embodiment than I can do. But I started to think about, okay, what is the paper that I write over and over, and how do I approach it? And so I'm going to share a slide with you now. And I should, okay. I'll just take a second to share. Okay, you can see that okay? Great, thank you. Arrange it so I can see all of you. One thing I should say though is if you have questions, raise your hand or unmute yourself and just ask as we go along, because I could easily, in the kind of effort to be compact talking about this, skip over things that make it nonsensical. So the question that I want to deal with today is really, what's the big question I try and look at in every single paper, and then what's led me through a different set of processes? And the answer is, for me, the basic question I've always tried to answer is how social change happens, and more probably precisely how social structures, what role social structures play in how actors try and affect social change. And so for me, there's kind of three things going on. There's actors who are trying to make things happen. There's social change, which ends up at the other side of the kind of equation. And there are some kind of social structures that either help those actors, interfere with those actors, get in the way of those actors, whatever it is. And for me, it really started out with institutions. I'm kind of a dyed-in-the-wool institutional theory person. That's how I was trained. That's where I come from. That's the literature that resonated with me 30 years ago. And when I began, it was really sort of when it was in the late or the kind of mid-1980s to early 1990s, when institutional theory was kind of really rocking, and people became interested in agency and those kinds of issues. And then there's been a sort of set of transitions, and I want to use a photo here to kind of talk through that transition and talk about the role of the body for me. So in this photo, in the foreground, you see two young men. One of them is injecting drugs. You can see a needle there. The other is kind of watching out or just standing with him. And this is in the downtown east side of Vancouver, where I lived for many years and where I did a lot of research on both addiction and homelessness. If you look back further in the alley, there's a lot of kind of tensions and ironies in the photo. And so it's quite a sunny day. You see shadows. Vancouver is a very beautiful city. If you haven't been there, you should really go. At the same time, this alley is strewn with litter. There's people so doing something in the background in terms of the garbage, but then there are other people in the very background kind of walking through the photo on the sidewalk, seemingly oblivious to what's going on in the alley in terms of the injections. And so the photo kind of sets up a lot of the tensions that were core to the research that I was doing in Vancouver from about 1990 to early 2000s. When I moved to Vancouver, and I moved from Victoria, also on the west coast of Canada, also you should go if you haven't been, it's also very beautiful. I moved to Vancouver, and what I found out was that there was an epidemic of injection drug overdoses, largely heroin and cocaine, at the time. Now, a small parenthesis caveat, actually, the overdose of epidemics now is actually much greater than it was at the time, but at the time it seemed horrendous. where overdoses had gone from about 20 a year in the province to 300 a year, and no one knew what to do about it. No one knew how to respond. And so I started a research project. I knew nothing about the domain. It's not my world. Healthcare is not my world. But I started a project looking at people's responses to it, and particularly one response, which was a supervised injection site, which became the kind of focus of my research and later turned into a paper. Now, like I said, when I started this project, I was dyed-in-the-wool institutionalist, and if you're not kind of from that world, all I really mean by that is I was focusing on cultural and social taken for granted ideas, assumptions, beliefs about the world, and the role that they played both in the epidemic of drug overdoses and in people's responses to those overdoses. So for instance, in this case, assumptions like, why do people take drugs? What is a drug user? What does an overdose look like? What do we mean by an overdose? Whose fault is it? Whose responsibility is it? What is addiction? So those are the kind of institutionalized ideas that set the frame for this. My focus was on supervised injection sites as the kind of innovation that was translated from Europe into Vancouver, which became the first government-sanctioned injection site in North America, and all the work that was done to translate that. And the basic finding from an institutional perspective was that while Insight, as it was called, or is called, was the first government-sanctioned supervised injection site, there were really many injection sites or translations of the concept of an injection site over the 10 years leading up to the government opening their own. And so there were illegal sites and educational sites. There were drug users using their hotels as safe injection sites for other drug users. There were church basements, a whole myriad of physical sites that were translating the concept. There were also discursive translations in reports, in meetings, in frameworks, in speeches, in an election that really shaped Vancouver a lot. There was a mayoral election in which the injection site played a key role. And that really became the story. And that's a sort of the 1-minute version of what I'm not going to talk about today, which kind of set up, for me, thinking a lot more about, in some sense, the people in this picture. And so I'll go back to the photo. And the very first thing I said was that in the foreground, there are these two young men. One of them was injecting drugs. And what happened was the experience of studying homelessness and addiction and a lot of interaction with the literature and conversations with people led my colleague Nelson Phillips and I to write a book on what we call social symbolic work, and a key piece of that was the idea that institutions are important. We both think institutions are important, but there are lots of what we call objects in the world that are not institutions. But if you're interested in this basic question of how do people make social change, and what are the role of social structures, and what are the other structures in play? So if I went back to the insight story and the addiction story, what are the other structure, the other objects that I could start to kind of elicit from the story other than the ideas, other than the injection site, other than the concept of addiction? And so I'll start with this photo again and these two young men. So immediately, if you look at it closely and you sort of imagine and picture these young men, and this one with a needle in his arm, you start to think about, well, who are they? Why are they there? What was their career? So there's, if you're familiar with the Chicago School of Sociology, there's an idea of a career of a drug user. And this is from the 60s, when people were looking at marijuana smokers, and people don't end up in alleys injecting drugs overnight. They get there somehow. And this idea of a career is really important to something like a drug user, because a drug user, just like an accountant, has skills, has a background, has a history, has a network, has other resources they draw on to make it possible for them to end up in an alley shooting drugs. And so the book we wrote was kind of trying to understand what are all these different objects, and particularly starting with the self. Now, I think of myself, and people would describe me probably as quite a macro organization theory person, dealing with kind of the social level, the organizational level, field level. And yet for us, the self is really operates at a kind of similar level to institutions. Now, in the paper I wrote that was institutionally focused, there's lots of people, there's lots of actors, there's drug users, there's bureaucrats, there's politicians, there's activists, etc., all doing stuff. But what they're doing it to are the institutions that structure their lives. There's very little talk about what actors are doing to bodies, their own bodies and other bodies, or even one step kind of more abstract from that, what they're doing to their selves, what they're doing to their identities, to their emotions, to their careers, and so on. So the self really, I think, is a really useful idea and kind of a stopping point and a kind of holder for the body, but I think it's still possibly remote from the body in some ways. And so if I go back to the picture, then I look at it again, I see the man closest to the picture is leaning over, the needle's actually in his body, and if I start to think about, well, forget the self for a second, think of the body as the object under manipulation, and the role of the body in this story of social change, then I think lots of things start to become apparent that weren't apparent from either the institutional level or even the level of the self. So all kinds of things are happening. There's the penetration of a needle into the body. There's the flowing of drugs into a vein. There's the effect of the drugs on the brain and the nervous system, but also the respiratory system, also the circulatory system. There's the possibility of injury or abuse when the young man is high. There's the horrific physical sensations after the drugs have left his body and before he's injected again. There's the physical conditions in which he's living, sleeping, eating. One of the things in the photo that's not in play in the photo at the moment is the water in the alley. And one of the things, one of the great problems for drug users who inject in alleys is they don't have a source of clean water. And so often they'll use alley sort of puddle water to cook the drugs, which is obviously not clean. It's got lots of contaminants in it. Then you're not just shooting heroin and whatever is mixed up with the heroin into your body, you're also shooting the contaminants from the water, laying in puddles into your veins and so on. So this kind of starts to build out, for me, a much more visceral understanding of the process of social change. I go back right to the kind of original question, because my question hasn't changed. I'm still really interested in how does social change happen and the role of social structures. But I think of the body as a social structure, then I think there's a whole different set of dynamics in play that are left out when I just focus on the kind of institutional level. So where this has taken me is working with some colleagues, and if any of you were at this event last year, you might have met Emily Heafy, who was one of my colleagues, and we're working on a annals paper looking at body work and the idea of kind of analogous to identity work or emotion work, institutional work, the body as a form of work. And body work is not our phrase. Body work is a literature, relatively small literature in sociology, and we're interested in organizational body work. So body work that's embedded in some way inside of organizational life and kind of motivated by it, animated, and so on. And so I'm just going to leave you with the last slide, which is there's lots to share. I could talk for hours about this paper we're doing with Emily. I'm going to talk for 1 minute about it instead, just to leave you with one of the ideas, which is that when we look at the body as a focus of work, it's caught in a whole series of tensions inside organizational life. Cultural tensions, health tensions, and political tensions, that structure all kinds of the work that's being done. It motivates it, but it also constrains it. Um, so just for instance, in terms of cultural tensions, there's a real tension between the lived experience associated with the body and cultural conformity associated with the body. And if we think of, for instance, older people in care homes in the United Kingdom, or my mother is in a care home in Canada, there's all kinds of tensions between her experience of her body and the lived experience of her body and the expectations built into care homes associated with the older body. And there's really interesting work done that looks at that tension. And these are the tensions that we found going through the literature in management. It doesn't really talk about body work directly necessarily. It talks about the body and some of the tensions. In terms of health, there's tensions between thriving and suffering that result from body work. There's tensions, political ones, between autonomy and oppression. And I think all of these tensions kind of emanate from this much broader tension where our bodies are really often understood as synonymous with ourselves, or at least the kind of boundaries of ourselves. So we think of the body as a vessel of the self. And at the same time, I'm talking about the body as a social structure involved in processes of social change. And so it's also an object of manipulation. So body work is not done only by ourselves on ourselves. Body work is done by other individuals, by collectives, by networks of actors, by organizations, by developing systems, all intentionally to shape the body in some way, either its meaning or how it functions or the materiality of the body. And so that was, I used up my 20 minutes. I said I would only take 15. I'm going to end there just because if I don't end now, I'll never end. And so I'm happy to take questions on just absolutely anything, what I talked about, or random things. Thank you.